want to present some work we've been doing with Eliza Palazzo, who's a landscape architect here at Adelaide University, and Nat Wiseman has been assisting us with this work, looking at the relationship between culture and biodiversity. And it's an issue that I've been very interested in for the last 15 years or so. And I guess it's a contrast to a lot of the way that biodiversity is looked upon in Europe, where culture is fundamentally linked to biodiversity in most of their planning, most of their activities. Here we almost deny culture. We're aiming for the natural all the time, and natural has come up throughout this conference endlessly. And some of our work, and we are presented on the first day, about some of the work we're doing with Indigenous communities in this, and that's starting to really question how natural our natural is, or how natural our nature is. But also, there's... not on. Also, there's very important linkages between how everybody manages the landscape and everybody interrelates in relation to the landscape. So this work is particularly looking at the biocultural, the biological and the cultural, and how they interact within the McLaren Vale. And it's work that has been supported by Juna to do a little pilot study down there. It hasn't been a major piece of work, and we're still working through a lot of the results. Eliza's been looking much more at the landscape elements as a landscape architect. I've been looking more at the stories that people are raising. What are the key stories, the narratives that you like about biodiversity? And I'm going to talk to two questions and try and answer them, and we haven't got answers yet, but I'll talk to them. Should the values of biodiversity in productive agricultural systems be promoted into policy, as they are in Europe, but are fundamentally avoided in relation to most of our policy in Australia? And is that agrobiodiversity, agricultural biodiversity, in the McLaren Vale World Heritage? And I'll come to that point in a second. We walked and talked with 17 unrepresentative farmers down the McLaren Vale. We weren't looking for any sense of average or representativeness. These people were outliers in many ways. They're innovators, so there's no pretense at rigour here. We very much targeted those special producers who were trying things. Some of them were leftovers from a previous age, the almond producers that still hang on from an earlier time in the McLaren Vale. Some are very much the innovators. There's some really interesting work going on with vegetable growers down there, Nat Wiseman being one of them, doing very innovative work. And then there's a whole bundle of people in between those extremes who are trying things, who are moving beyond what you could consider as the normal. If you're just going to send a questionnaire out to all farmers within that area, the normal would primarily be the great wine grape producers within this area. Some of them are wine grape producers, but in most of those cases, those grape growers were the innovative ones. And you can see, I guess almost as an indication of that dynamic, is the fact that we're getting such a large number of biodynamic organic people who talk about minimal intervention in their agricultural systems, and some conventional. But the conventional were the last barley wheat cropper down in Aldinga, and someone who's got very interesting interaction between quarry and grazing activities. So these are not representative, and no claim is made in relation to that. The first question has two drivers, it's two bosses if you like. One is trying to inform South Australian biodiversity policy, and Juna was interested in supporting this work because it was interested in questions of culture and biodiversity that could inform a next iteration in biodiversity policy. But also there's a push going on for some sort of listing or investigation of a listing of the Mount Lofty Ranges for World Heritage listing, and so we're trying to inform both of those. My background's in looking at agricultural biodiversity within systems, and so we looked at how that diversity is used in an individual field, within a farm or a business, across the region, and how that might relate to global resource supplies. Most of the work in this area has been done in relation to global resources, that the agricultural biodiversity provides genetic materials that can be used universally. For the McLaren Vale, there isn't much of that, but those first three are very, very important. Why they're important comes down to this image. This shows from 1993 to 2008 the lost diversity that's occurred, particularly in the southern part of the Vale, where mostly It's been a transfer from horticulture, and particularly almonds and soft fruits, or pastures and cereal cropping, to wine grape production during that time period. There's been effectively a collapse at the species level, or the systemic level, of agricultural biodiversity within that system during that period, you could argue. There's also been increasing urbanisation pressures, some of which have been alleviated through recent policies to establish a protection zone around the region. So when we're talking to people, we ask them, one of the key questions we ask them is, what is important biological heritage within the McLaren Vale? We get a lot of these answers, that it's the natural biodiversity. I'd like to see revegetation with a lot of diversity and a lot of the original ecology. There are still a lot of remnants of the original ecology, and that is a golden opportunity not to miss. That type of story is what you might expect within a conventional sense of what biodiversity might mean for South Australia into the future, and what we've looked at. A lot of the policy direction and investment has been to assist farmers to continue to expand this type of biodiversity. But a lot of people started to expand upon that idea and not draw a boundary between the native and what might be considered anathema to a sense of native biodiversity, which are the exotic species. This farmer says biodiversity is exactly what we have now. Almonds next door, we used to have an olive grove, gum trees, the native vegetation that is around, the broadacre cropping. There is a lot of it around the place, even to what is grown in the garden, because they attract insects. We live with half a dozen kangaroos on the lawn, just from a point of view of interest. So they're not defining a barrier between the natural and the exotic, or the invasive exotic even, within that context. In this sense, what is being generated by farmers themselves, what is there within the landscape with natural, and in fact what is there within the landscape that is exotic, is all considered bundled together in that context. And you get a whole lot of examples of this. There's 75 pages of narratives. I've tried to just pick out a few. Things like the big red gums provide a sanctuary, beauty, shade and buffer from non-organic neighbouring properties, so they don't get spray drift across to their organic property. Values from the natural species in that way. The natural species provide pest control and fertility benefits. In particular, a lot of people talked about the native species providing habitat for pest predators to be able to fly in and out of people's properties, in particular wasps and other systems. But people didn't stop there. They talked about the diversity of the agriculture itself. There's very important local varieties of almonds, Johnsons and others that still remain within this landscape, which were developed within South Australia. One of the few crop varieties, I would argue, that's ever been developed within the state. This has allowed the respondent to manage water constraints, control their supply chain very effectively and market through the local Wollonga farmer market by defining their product as such a unique one within that landscape. Other examples, wine grape varietal diversity is being used increasingly to manage environmental variation, particularly as the area gets hotter and there's been a serious series of very warm and dry springs in the region. So there's a whole range of ways that people are using that diversity. You start to hear stories like this. With the diversity of crops we have total control of what we sell at the markets. We don't have to offload at cheap prices because it's going to go off before we sell it. Biodiversity for us is growing a multitude of things. We haven't worried about planting natives because it is already a beautiful setting. For us to have a good little ecosystem where we don't have to use pesticides or things like that, it is good for us to have all these different crops because we have different organisms hiding in different areas. No native mention. In fact, they've excluded the natives from their healthy ecosystem. And you get examples of one after the other of these types of ways that the local agricultural biodiversity is not only providing benefits to their business and complex benefits to their business associated with supply chains, production systems, etc., but is also providing ways for better environmental management in different ways. I'm not going to go through all those in detail. Again, there's a lot of detail there, but very innovative approaches. Where this is interesting is that much of the world defines this agrobiodiversity and is quite specific about trying to conserve it. In Australia, we're quite happy to let it come and go without any real observance in policy. So agrobiodiversity under the Food and Agricultural Organisation definition is the variety and variability of animals, plants and microorganisms that are used directly or indirectly for food and agriculture. That indirectly is important because that may, within this system, include much of that native biodiversity that's interacting with agricultural systems very effectively at the same time. So it doesn't just include the diversity of genetic resources or species used for food, fodder or fibre, etc. It's also those non-harvested species that provide so much of the complexity within this agro-ecosystem. Where this is important, and looking at that first question, is this might present some interesting information for the South Australian Government as it starts to revise its no species loss policy. Currently there's very much a focus on conservation of natural ecosystems and species, and I would certainly not argue that that focus be redirected away from that native species, but maybe we could start to pick up that within certain areas and certain places our agricultural biological heritage or the cultural biological heritage should be at least acknowledged within biodiversity policy and, alongside or in association with that biodiversity policy. The next question then is this sufficient to answer another question of, is it World Heritage? Probably not by itself. For World Heritage within an agrobiodiversity definition, you'd probably want to see unique biodiversity like you might find in the Fertile Crescent, which is only found there and nowhere else. What we find there is the diversity is much more important for establishing the resilience of that local system, for building the capacity to exploit diversity and to ensure that people can deal with shocks over time. Where this is interesting in relation to potential World Heritage is one of the criteria, and you've got to meet criteria to get listed in World Heritage, is that it needs to be an outstanding example of a traditional human settlement, land use or sea use, maybe, but where human interaction with the environment, especially when it has become vulnerable under the impact of irreversible change. I think there's a case that could be made to say that what we're doing down there in relation to using the agrobiodiversity and other policy interventions starts to fit into that unique definition. Why? Well, a lot's been made of climate change, but you get this type of in this conference already. I'm not going to go into it in any more detail, but you get this type of story already, that the region is responding to an increased vulnerability in relation to climate change. That key point. Now, the one farmer said, now I was just boasting you about the McLaren Vale is great. It can be pretty harsh too. You can lose a crop to heat damage, we have discovered. I was thinking it was next generation's problem, but it has been getting warm and hot pretty quick. So we just wonder, unfortunately, because we don't want to, whether we could sustain the grates without irrigation. I just don't know. But it is good that the purple pipe there is we needed. So the purple pipe in that quote is the recycled water scheme that they have down in the McLaren Vale, which is a very important part. Also, people are exploring a whole lot of varietal diversity. We're doing experimentation, particularly with varieties from Spain or Italy, those drier parts of Europe, where there's a whole lot of varietal diversity. And in fact, when you look at the data for what's being planted down there now, from 1998 to 2013, what was were the dominant species, Shiraz, Cabernet Sauvignon, Grenache and Merlot, back in the late 90s, are no longer being planted extensively. And there's a whole lot of exploration into all of these new types of varieties, these varieties from southern Spain, from Portugal, from the drier parts of Europe, from Greece and southern Italy. There's a wealth of diversity that's being put in to experiment with opportunities for dealing with this drying climate. Fantastic innovation that's underway. Add this to a whole lot of other activities associated with new ways of irrigating, pruning, mulching, blending, the multiple vineyards in the different climatic zones that farmers are using, the restriction on volumes, a whole lot of systemic strategies, and you realise there's a whole lot of innovation going on within this space. Add that again onto some of the policy interventions, particularly regulatory controls on water, land and biodiversity, and the activities that are going on there in relation to social processes of the Willunga Market, the Friends of Willunga, the McLaren Vale Grapevine and Tourism Association, the state government's activities in climate change adaptation, and you might perhaps generate an argument that we could, this is a place which could become a unique space for understanding and experimenting with climate change and adaptation to that idea. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.